Liberalism is an approach that explains outcomes in the international system based on the type of political regime in a state or international institutions, instead of a focus on power. Liberalism is a reformulation of the legalist approach that was severely delegitimized with the rise of fascism in the 1930s. An important liberal critique of realism is the realist apparent assumption of the unitary rational actor, the idea that you can treat the state as if it was a single decision maker. Realists make this a deliberately simplifying assumption to make realist theories more parsimonious. So realists don't think it actually describes how reality works. They just find that states behave as if they were individual decision makers, and so they're treated that way. The liberal critique is that the unitary rational actor assumption is too simple to explain the great variation in state behavior. Instead, an examination of the interaction of the domestic actors can provide more accurate predictions of outcomes than realism. Democratic, authoritarian, totalitarian, or military governments have different domestic constitutional configurations, and these produce different policy effects. The interaction of domestic actors explains changes in policy. For example, democracies produce different policy outcomes than non-democracies. Military regimes are more likely to escalate crises. Parliamentary and presidential systems differ with respect to defeating foreign counterinsurgencies, and there are a great many other differences. The democratic peace argument. In the early 1990s, Bush and later Clinton repeatedly mentioned that the US wanted democracy to spread around the world because democracies do not go to war against each other. This is from President Clinton's 1999 speech. Quote, "Promoting democracy abroad does more than foster our ideals. It advances our interests because we know that the larger the pool of democracies, the better off we and the entire community of nations will be. Democracies create free markets that make far more reliable trading partners and are far less likely to wage war on one another. While democracy will not soon take hold everywhere, it is in our interest to do all we can to enlarge the community of free and open societies." Close quotes. President Woodrow Wilson said essentially the same thing 80 years earlier, and it seems convincing. Of course, and I want to qualify it, President Woodrow Wilson also reintroduced racial segregation in Washington. So the question can be asked, democracy for whom? The statistical evidence largely supports the democratic peace theory argument. Democracies tend not to initiate wars. However, democracies are no more likely to be peaceful than non-democratic states. The US, for example, invaded Grenada in 1983, and then it invaded Panama in 1989. Regional peace occurs when strong states with established inner peace enter into relations. Now, before 1914, there was a conflict of interest between the democracies, and this was reflected by a higher dispute rate than even non-democratic dyads. So the US and England had a dispute over rights to interfere in Venezuela, and they almost came to blows, but the English made a choice. They chose to ally with the US to concede to American interests in order to win their eventual support against Germany. After 1945, democracies had a common interest in confronting the Soviet Union, and that therefore there was a confounding variable that diminished conflicts of interest. They all had the same foreign policy goal, so why would they fight? So the sources of thought on democratic regime behavior. We have liberal imperialism. Classical Greeks and northern Italian states, described by authors like Machiavelli, thought that mixed republics, which focused on liberty, were effectively very warlike. So there was no democratic peace phenomenon in the system, either of ancient Greece or in northern Italy, or the democratic representative process in the city of Rome didn't make it more peaceful. There's liberal internationalism. This was formulated by Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, and he conjectured the existence of a Pacific Union. This would be a separate peace between democracies. So this world would contain 3 definite articles. 1, a state has a republican constitution, and this would include moral autonomy, individualism, and social order. 2, republics could create a Pacific Union between each other. And 3, cosmopolitan law. Laws apply to locals, and they also apply to foreigners, and this facilitates commerce. Peace follows from international trade by taking it away from state policy. War outside the Union can happen to protect freedom and property or support liberal allies. So what causes the democratic peace? So let's start with a definition. Democracies are states with a liberal ideology that includes free speech, regular competitive elections, almost universal suffrage, and have had at least one democratic change of government. Robert Dahl used a different term for democracy. He called it polyarchy, and these are his elements. 1, freedom to form and join organizations. 2, freedom of expression. 3, the right to vote. 4, eligibility for public office. 5, the right of political leaders to compete for support and votes. 6, alternative sources of information in the media. 7, free and fair elections. 8, institutions for making government policies depend on votes and other expressions of preference. We also have liberal pacifism, and this was formulated by Joseph Schumpeter. He saw capitalism combined with democracy as creating liberal pacifism. So for him, the definition of liberal is 1, individual freedom, 2, political participation, 3, private property, and 4, equality of opportunity. But this does raise the question of what is democracy? Here we have the percentage of competitive systems in the international system is defined as a democracy. So in 1812, not a lot of countries, just a few percent. And even within those countries that were here ascribed as democratic, half the population, women, didn't vote. This is a more conservative evaluation of when democracy started, and it includes women voters. And you can see that democracy is therefore, from the perspective of this lecture, a century and a half old at most. You can see here the increase in the franchise or the vote in England. Now it should be qualified, because I've looked at this part of the history, that the vote was not exclusively increased in England and shared with the lower classes because the lower classes were demanding it. There was also a significant number of upper class people who wanted the vote to spread because they disagreed ideologically with some of the more conservative policies that were not necessarily associated with votes. And so by having the franchise spread, they created allies. I call this the Flamininus effect. Flamininus was a competitor in the social wars in Rome, and the way that the social war dynamic worked was that as Rome was constantly caught in these civil wars during the social wars, that was the century and a half before Christ, before the Common Era, the Romans that were doing the most poorly and were losing would go outside of Rome, collect allies, take those resources, challenge the conservative forces in Rome, and then extend Roman citizenship to these new communities. And that's essentially how, through violence and the creation of these allies, the Flamininus effect, that you had citizenship spread from Rome to the entire Italian peninsula. So you had the same dynamic going on in England, a lot of the vote was pushed by the political elite itself, the wealthiest who lived at the top. Now the problem is that the Polity 4 data set gives the US a score of 9 on 10 as a democracy in 1812, at a time when you had legalized slavery. But it only gave Peru a 2 on 10 in 1994. And I think it has to do with the valuations are not objective. They're related to what was thought of as the most democratic state at the time. And so it's a problem in terms of the scoring because these scores are not comparable across time. So there are three explanations for the democratic peace. The first one is the normative cause of the democratic peace, right? The reason why democracies don't fight each other. So here, the key element are liberal ideas. These are cosmopolitan, which means they are applied to all states. You have liberty and toleration for life and property, and tyranny over individuals is not democracy. Liberal democracies are therefore seen as reasonable, predictable, and trustworthy. But democracies are still as warlike as other states, so it depends on perception. Citizens can identify other liberal states and therefore treat them preferentially in a form of a legal zone of law. Citizens only support war typically if it brings peace and are therefore more likely to support war against illiberal states. And in theory, illiberal leaders are therefore selected out. Now this is not always true. How many times was Winston Churchill or Richard Nixon accused of being a warmonger? Right? Whether or not it's actually true. A second explanation for the democratic peace is the structural argument, the argument of institutional constraints. The same domestic institutions that encourage peaceful negotiations and compromise cause democratic states to interact with each other on that same basis. You basically get a lawyer. The more mature the democracy, the greater is the above tendency. Democratic interactions with non-democratic states does not lead to the same restraint. Democracies have participated in imperialism and wars of conquest. Structural domestic practices are extended to the creation of compatible international organizations. So of course the United Nations looks like some sort of early medieval Christian council where you have a panel of people, representatives who debate ideas. So the statistics. Norms, a byproduct of a successful collective security system that manages to alter expectations and legitimate behavior in the international system, fluctuate in their effect on peace. In the Metternich concert, which is 1816 to 1848, this is Metternich, the great diplomat who set up the concert system after the defeat of Napoleon, was generally peaceful. However, the Bismarckian period, he unified Prussia with Germany in 1870, and he basically reigned from 1849 to 1870, was a less peaceful period. Both periods had the same number of disputes, but 4 of these escalated to war in the Bismarckian period. So, you look at the international system and the impact of democracies at that time, it's not clear what explains the difference between the two periods. Right? Clearly, the presence of the ability to negotiate between states didn't create peace. There wasn't an institutional pacification. The third explanation is organizational. This is a marginal explanation. It's not one of the two main ones, which are normative and structural. So the assumption is that leaders seek policies that will minimize their displacement by other groups, their removal. 2, democratic leaders seek a plurality, which is the largest group of voters, whereas authoritarian leaders appeal to a smaller number of constituents. 3, democratic leaders are more likely to erode the size of their coalition by alienating minority supporters. Therefore, the longer the tenure of an authoritarian leader, the more likely they are to believe they will survive a political gamble, and so they are more likely to risk engaging in war. In addition, democracies are more transparent and are therefore less able to conduct wars. Declarations made by democratic leaders are more credible because of the consequences of misleading the electorate. The cost to a democratic political leader of changing a public commitment is called an audience cost. Democratic leaders are more vulnerable to audience costs than authoritarian leaders who typically have a more narrow support base. This is a theory developed by Fearon, F-E-A-R-O-N. So what's the evidence? Victory in war reduces by 25% the likelihood of removal from office. 2. Costly wars increase the likelihood of removal. And what's some of the other evidence? 90% of democratic leaders lose their office within a year after losing a war, whereas only 50% of non-democratic leaders lose office, suggesting democratic leaders are more cautious about initiating conflicts. Democratic states are therefore more careful when going to war, and are therefore more likely to win the wars they fight, because of course they're choosing the wars they can win. And so democracies are victorious 81% of the time. For example, neither US Presidents Truman or Johnson sought re-election while involved in their unwinnable wars. The wars in Korea for Truman and Vietnam for Johnson. So the overall statistical evaluation has been that the normative model is more robust than the structural, meaning domestic populations judge other society as being liberal or not, whether or not they're democratic. And it's a more convincing argument than the structural argument, which is it's the institutions that interact. Now there are exceptions that abound. 1790 to 1798, the French-American War, they were both democracies. 1803, 1812, US-UK, both democracies. 1861, 1863, US-UK dispute, both democracies. Ecuador-Colombia, 1863, both democracies. 1870, France and Prussia, debatable. Prussia had a legislature, and the legislature was powerful. But the bureaucracy and the military leadership of the state also had significant extra constitutional powers. 1895, 1896 dispute between the US and UK over Venezuela, both democracies. 1898 Spanish-American War, big dispute. How exactly do we characterize Spain? Was it democratic? It had a constitution similar to that of the US. 1899, United States, Philippines, and the Second Philippine War. 1899 to 1902, the Anglo-Boer War. The Dutch definitely were self-ruled. 1919, the Lithuanian-Polish War. 1940, the British attack on the French fleet. Now, arguably, the Vichy government at the time wasn't elected. They were appointed as a part of the French capitulation after the Nazi defeat of France. 1940, the French-Thailand War. The 1941-44 War of Finland in the Second World War against Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, the US, and the UK. But of course, we never fought Finland directly. The Finnish fought the Soviet Union. The 1948 Israeli-Lebanon conflict is a part of Israel's War of Independence. The 1965 India-Pakistan conflict. The 1967 Israel-Lebanon conflict. The 1971 Indo-Pakistan War, although again, heavily debated because Pakistan had a constrained government, and that government had suppressed the previous election. The 1974 Cyprus-Turco-Cypriot conflict. The 1981-82 Israel-Lebanon conflict. The 1999 NATO-Serbian conflict. The 2006 Israel-Lebanon conflict. The 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict. So many exceptions. Are these really democracies? So these exceptions should suggest that it is not that democracies don't go to war, but that they reduce the likelihood of war. What is the utility of a theory that cannot fail, that states that change their regime types in the period before a conflict erupts into war, which raises the question of the utility of democracy in preventing war in the first place? So a lot of those cases had countries that were democracies and they changed their regimes just prior to the war. So was the war chosen by the democracy, or was it a result of the change in government? There are 6 problems with democratic peace theory. First of all, there's no theoretical foundation, and the foundation that exists could be a spurious effect. Gibler's argument is that democracies are less likely to fight with each other because they've already settled their border disputes. And it is the peace resulting from settling the border dispute which has created the democratic peace. This was argued by Otto Hintz in 1906. Authoritarian political systems are more likely during periods of a danger of war because the presence of a large military more easily facilitates repression of most of the political constituency. This is why democracies tend to be found on islands and cluster together on continents where they're essentially safe. The second objection is that it's a tautological definition. Definitions of democracy and war change to protect the hypothesis, to protect the proposition. For example, property and gender requirements excluded many from voting right up until the 20th century. So these were not really democracies, were they? But they're defined as democracies. Number 3, democratic peace theory is not statistically significant. There are so very few democratic states over the centuries, and so very few opportunities, therefore, for democracies to fight each other. Number 4, the problem of subjectivity. So, if you have a desire for peace or war, this could be determined by whether or not you think someone else is democratic or despotic. So, mutual perceptions are crucial. In the War of 1812, the British characterized the Americans as non-democratic, and the Americans characterized the British as non-democratic. The British had a monarchy, the Americans had slavery. During the Spanish-American War of 1899, the Americans characterized Spain as backward, and therefore, maybe constitutionally democratic, but otherwise socially not democratic. What do you think of these cases? Spain was actually democratic by today's institutional definition. There's the problem of illiberal democracies. In Iran, there is voting that's generally fair and without corruption. There's also freedom of assembly. But there's the absence of freedom for the individual. There are heavy constraints on what individuals can do and say in public. Doesn't that have a constraining effect on democracy? How is Iran viewed by Western democracies? Number 6, democracies are very fragile, and so states under wartime threat are rarely democracies. This is the theory of the garrison state, where states in preparation for war adopt policies that harden themselves. A democracy undermines itself if it, 1, does not deliver material wealth, and 2, it destroys a traditional way of life, which is why a lot of democratic transitions are actually violent. If you're a traditional elite, or even if you're a traditional farmer, you may resist democratic progress. During the French Revolution, the French peasants in the Vendée revolted in order to protect their traditional rights and to protect their landowners. And democracies fail all the time. They fail when they don't produce what they promise, which is economic wealth. Eastern Europe abandoned the Warsaw Pact in 1989, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. But it wasn't automatic. It mostly happened because the working class, and there was a large working class in the factories, decided to allow it to happen. But it could have gone the other way. Those workers gambled on a better prospect to get consumer goods, but they risked having their factories closed and losing their jobs. So it was a much more complex matter. It was not inevitable. So here's a list of exceptions captured by hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. Liberal states trust liberal states and distrust illiberal states. The obvious exception to this is apartheid South Africa, which eventually collapsed in 1993. The US and UK were very close allies of South Africa and built for South Africa the largest naval base south of the equator in the world. South Africa provided titanium, which is the main material to build combat aircraft, platinum. It was the largest source of those materials outside of the Soviet Union. It had uranium. It was a key protector of the oil supply coming from the Persian Gulf in the supertankers. South Africa received aircraft from Western states. Despite having a racialized and a segregated political system that excluded the majority of the local population from voting, it was seen as a key Western ally until the 1980s, when policies were adopted by most Western states against it. Second hypothesis, liberals expect peace with other liberal states. When democratic India, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, invaded East Pakistan to turn it into Bangladesh, they were confronted by a U.S. aircraft carrier, the Enterprise, which had been sent from the coast of Vietnam by American President Richard Nixon, who wanted to signal U.S. support for Pakistan. This caused India to abbreviate their amphibious landing at Cox's Bazar in East Pakistan and to remove their fleet from the Bay of Bengal. So India feared what the U.S. Navy, which was equipped with nuclear weapons on the aircraft carrier, would do. This is not what we would expect between two liberal democratic states. Hypothesis 3. Liberal states share the ends with other liberal states, but not with illiberal states. So North Korea was a despotic communist government in the 1970s and 80s. In the 1970s and 80s, South Korea had a military government that was also occasionally despotic, although perhaps not as badly as North Korea. But it was depicted as a westernized, progressive state and a close Western ally. Hypothesis 4. Liberal states will not change assessments of other states unless they change their institution. The Soviet Union in the Second World War was a communist totalitarian power, but was depicted by Western propaganda as a stalwart ally and a key ally against the fight against Nazism. Hypothesis 5. Liberal elites will agitate for their policies during war-threatening crises with other liberal states. We would have expected when the CIA went into Guatemala to overturn the socialist-leaning government there, that the elites there would have appealed to the American people. But the American people it didn't resonate with them to save a Central American state. So the CIA was ultimately able to overthrow the government in Guatemala in 1954. Not what you'd expect between two democracies. Hypothesis 6. During crises, liberal states follow liberal policies. Well, it's not always true. Russia was a democracy, but its policy in Chechnya against independence forces there was fairly brutal. Not what you'd expect from a democracy. So what are some of the alternative explanations for this phenomenon that democracies don't fight each other? They probably do indeed mostly not fight each other. But is it the structural, the normative, or the organizational argument that explains why, or another factor? So, explanation 1. Transnational organization makes peace. All of the hegemons in the post-Napoleonic period were democracies, and so they imposed that type of institution on the international system. First it was the UK, commerce-minded, and peace makes for good business, and then the US. The second explanation is distance prevents war. The democracies were just too far historically from each other to actually fight each other. The British and American navies met each other frequently on the high seas, but to actually have a war with each other, they'd have to travel to some flat land somewhere conveniently close where they could battle, but they didn't. They were too far. Hypothesis 3. Alliances make peace. Most of the democracies were in the same alliance repeatedly. There are a couple of exceptions, but those were very far away. Allies are not going to fight each other. 4. Wealth makes peace. Most of the countries that became democratic started with a strong middle class and a good commercial base, and so those that are in power don't want to imperil their wealth. So of course they're not going to encourage a war. Certainly not encourage a war with their trading partner. Number 5, political stability makes peace. Now, if you have political stability, then the people are happy, and then there's no need to go fight. There's no diversionary incentive to start a war somewhere else. Number 6, common culture causes both peace and democracy. This is an argument from Henderson about democracy and war. There's also the realist counter-argument, which is, well, where has democracy started? This is, again, Otto Hinz's argument. Well, it started in the most defensible states. First the UK, then the US, and of course it spreads across the English Channel to France. So we can see democracy, though, is not inevitable, but when it expands and spreads, there is a certain element of geographic contiguity. Now, there is an exception, and these are transitional democracies. When you have a new democracy, the change of regime type has often changed the basis of the legitimacy for that regime. So new governments often fall back on nationalist principles to get support from the population. So it's not surprising that the most war-prone states are democracies that are newly fashioned. And the classic example is Serbia. Serbia was created out of the collapsed state of Yugoslavia. The regime transitioned out of communism, but the political parties that did the best were ones that were nationalist, because they sought to resolve issues of the mixed ethnicities in the regions around Serbia. So Serbia aggressively participated in fighting in Bosnia by providing support, and ultimately was the target of NATO bombing over Kosovo. And so you'll find young democracies as not necessarily peaceful.